Most people assume that medieval warfare shut down at sunset. Popular imagination tells us that once darkness fell, armies slept, walls stood quiet, and fighting resumed at dawn. That assumption is wrong. Night was not a pause, it was a test, and the communities that survived were not the ones with the strongest walls, but the ones that understood how darkness reshaped fear, perception, and control. Let's begin where medieval defenders began, with the problem of darkness itself. Darkness was not concealment alone, it was disorientation and fear. In a pre-electric world, darkness was absolute. A moonless night could erase landscape, landmarks, and orientation within steps. That did not only conceal attackers, it disoriented defenders. Guards posted on walls strained to distinguish wind from footsteps, livestock from infiltrators. Panic spread faster at night because verification was slower. Medieval commanders understood that night attacks aimed less at physical destruction and more at confusion. A small raiding party could create the impression of a larger force simply by attacking from multiple points with noise and flame. The goal was to fracture response coordination. Once defenders moved without clear communication, gaps formed. This is why night defense doctrine in fortified towns increasingly emphasized disciplined light management. Torches were not scattered randomly, they were placed strategically to illuminate choke points while preserving darkness elsewhere. Light, when misused, blinds the user. When controlled, it blinds the intruder. In some regions, torches were mounted higher than eye level specifically to cast downward light and minimize shadowed hiding places near walls. Fire baskets, or braziers, served a similar purpose along battlements. Light placement was tactical geometry. Even more subtle was the use of decoy lighting. A lightly defended section might be left darker, inviting approach, while the actual response force waited in silence nearby. Attackers gravitated toward perceived weakness. Defenders shaped that perception. In modern preparedness terms, the principle remains intact. Light is not about visibility alone. It is about controlling perception, yours and theirs. Torches were used to control movement, not simply to see. In many castle courtyards and town gates, lighting was concentrated at entry points and narrow passages. This was intentional. An approaching attacker moving from darkness into torchlight was immediately silhouetted. Defenders retained visual clarity, while the intruder's night vision collapsed. Chronicles from English and French towns in the 13th and 14th centuries described gatehouses illuminated in ways that exposed the outer threshold while keeping inner defenders concealed behind murder holes and angled walls. The goal was asymmetry of vision. There is a direct lesson here. Illumination should favor the defender's position, not create equal visibility. Flooding an entire perimeter with light wastes resources and removes your own concealment. Medieval defenders learned to illuminate selectively, funneling attention and movement. Traps were psychological tools as much as physical barriers. When people hear the word trap, they imagine elaborate contraptions. Medieval defensive traps were often simple. Media group, scattered caltrops on dirt path, concealed pit trap with covering near castle wally stocky, distribute equally. Caltrops scattered in likely approach paths. Concealed pits near breaches. Spiked boards placed behind gates expected to be rammed. Their power was not in lethality alone. It was in slowing momentum. Night attacks depend on speed and coordination. A single man injured by a hidden obstacle forces hesitation in those behind him. Noise increases. Formation collapses. The caltrop, 4 iron spikes arranged so one always points upward, became a staple of defensive preparation. When scattered in tall grass or along likely cavalry routes, it forced attackers to slow or reroute. In darkness, its effectiveness multiplied. Town records from late medieval Germany show municipal purchases of caltrops not just during wartime, but as standing precautionary stock. Defense planning assumed that threats would come at night and without warning. The principle extends beyond physical traps. Barriers placed to force movement into predictable channels allowed defenders to concentrate manpower. Narrowed streets inside walled towns were sometimes deliberately obstructed with carts or debris during periods of unrest to prevent rapid movement if gates were breached. This was controlled friction, and friction favors the prepared side. Medieval watch systems were designed to fight fatigue, not just enemies. Night defense fails when alertness fails. Medieval communities understood that exhaustion was a vulnerability equal to a breached wall. Rotating watches were formalized in many towns. Curfews were enforced not merely for social control, but to reduce background noise and movement that could mask infiltration. The watchman's role was not ceremonial. In many cities, watch patrols moved continuously rather than standing fixed posts. Movement preserved wakefulness and signaled presence. Bell systems and coded horn signals developed to distinguish between fire, gate attack, and internal disturbance. Specific tones triggered specific responses. Ambiguity was the enemy. From a preparedness perspective, this highlights something often ignored. Communication protocols matter more at night. When visual cues degrade, prearranged signals prevent chaos. Medieval defense was less about heroics and more about disciplined procedure. There is also a social dimension. Night defense was communal. Citizens were expected to respond to alarm. Survival depended on shared responsibility. A community that outsourced vigilance entirely to a small guard force was weaker. Fire was both weapon and countermeasure. Night raids frequently relied on arson. Thatch roofs and wooden gates were vulnerable. Fire forced defenders to divide attention between extinguishing flames and repelling attackers. In response, many towns mandated stone construction within walls and enforced regulations on storing flammable materials. Buckets, wells, and sand stores were positioned strategically. More interestingly, defenders sometimes used controlled fire themselves. Flaming projectiles were launched not just to burn siege equipment, but to illuminate enemy positions beyond walls. Light and fire became reconnaissance tools. In coastal regions vulnerable to Viking-style raids, signal fires on elevated ground provided early warning. These were primitive but effective communication networks spanning miles. The lesson here is layered redundancy. Medieval communities did not rely on a single wall or a single tactic. They built systems, visual signals, sound signals, physical barriers, and environmental design working together. Over time, these night defense practices shaped broader military doctrine. As warfare professionalized in the late medieval and early modern periods, the logic of controlled illumination and obstacle placement informed fortification design. Bastion systems incorporated angled walls that eliminated blind spots. Star forts were built to prevent attackers from exploiting darkness along flat curtain walls. The idea that defenders should shape the environment rather than merely react to it became foundational. Defensive depth replaced static resistance. Even urban planning reflected these lessons. Narrow, winding streets in medieval towns were not only organic growth, they became defensive advantages, limiting cavalry movement and forcing attackers into predictable paths. When early modern armies codified camp security, they borrowed from town practice perimeter obstacles, picket lines, controlled lantern placement, layered sentries. The torch and trap evolved, but their principles endured. What this means for modern preparedness is less dramatic but equally practical. Modern technology changes tools, not fundamentals. Darkness still alters perception. Fatigue still undermines judgment. Movement through constrained spaces still favors defenders who understand their terrain. Controlled lighting remains relevant. Motion-activated illumination, if placed thoughtfully, preserves defender concealment while exposing intruders. Over-illumination, on the other hand, advertises your position and consumes resources. Obstacles need not be medieval in form to follow medieval logic. Landscaping, fencing, gravel paths that amplify footsteps, and deliberate choke points create friction that slows unwanted movement. The objective is not aggression, it is delay and detection. Communication planning matters more than equipment. Prearranged signals among household members, clear protocols for response, and rehearsed coordination reduce panic. Medieval towns survived not because they eliminated fear, but because they structured response. There is also a sobering truth embedded in these historical practices. Night defense was not about invincibility, it was about buying time, time for reinforcements, time for neighbors to assemble, time for daylight. Preparedness is rarely about absolute control. It is about increasing the cost of intrusion and preserving decision-making clarity under stress. The deeper lesson is about mindset, not hardware. Medieval defenders did not romanticize darkness. They respected it. They assumed vulnerability and planned accordingly. They understood that most threats exploit inattention rather than brute force. In studying these practices, what stands out is not brutality or spectacle, but discipline. Communities maintained watch rotations for generations. They invested in mundane tools like caltrops and signal bells. They regulated building materials to reduce fire risk. None of it was glamorous. All of it mattered. When historians examine why certain towns survived repeated raids while others collapsed, the answer is rarely a single heroic stand. It is preparation embedded into daily life. That is the enduring relevance of the torch and the trap. Light placed with intention, obstacles positioned with foresight, communication systems rehearsed before crisis, and a community that understands night as a condition to be managed, not feared. If there is value in studying medieval night defense, it lies in recognizing that vulnerability is universal across centuries. Technology shifts, human behavior does not. Fatigue, overconfidence, poor communication, these remain the weak points. Understanding how earlier societies confronted those weaknesses does more than satisfy curiosity. It sharpens judgment. History, when examined closely, is less about nostalgia and more about pattern recognition. The torch and the trap are not relics. They are reminders that security begins with clarity of thought and deliberate design. If you value serious historical analysis that extracts usable lessons rather than repeating familiar stories, subscribe to the Prepper Historian and share this video with others who approach history as preparation, not entertainment.